Sometimes when I talk about the limits to growth, people will say, oh, but wasn't that debunked? Wasn't that refuted years ago? That's a widespread impression that results from some very clever public relations work on the part of a number of economists who banded together in the late 1970s. They said, well, you know, how can this be? Growth is the very basis of modern economies, so the idea of limits to growth is, this is pernicious stuff. We've got to nip this in the bud. So they hired high-powered public relations firms to come up with arguments against limits to growth and to take material out of context from the book and use it to make it appear as though the book was saying things that it wasn't actually saying. And so many people have heard that information second or third hand and assumed that the limits to growth was somehow incorrect. In fact, it's been updated periodically since 1972 using more sophisticated software, better data, and the results, rather than becoming more encouraging, have become just the opposite. One of the most important resources that we're talking about, of course, is oil, petroleum, the basis for our modern economies. Coal was, of course, the first important fossil fuel used in the 19th century and up through the first decades of the 20th. But since the middle decades of the 20th century, oil has fueled the engines of global growth. And the oil industry really was centered in the United States for many decades. The US was the world's foremost oil producer, in fact, the world's foremost oil exporter for a very long time. And it was one of the very first countries to experience peak oil. The US has been in a post-peak oil condition since 1970. Discoveries, which are the red bars, the red vertical bars, discovery in the US peaked around 1930 and extraction peaked in 1970. It's always that way. Discovery peaks first. Naturally, you have to find the oil before you can extract it. So this is the template. This is a pure example of peak oil and what it looks like. But it's happening in more and more countries as time goes on. If the US was the first, it was quickly followed by others. Most countries that produce oil are now seeing declining production. Global oil discoveries have been declining since about 1964. That's discoveries of new oil fields. And typically, newer oil fields that are found these days are much smaller than ones that were being found in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And the range of sizes of oil fields is extremely great. There are few oil fields in the world that produce up to or exceeding 1 million barrels per day. But there are many tens of thousands of oil fields that only produce 10, 20, 100, or 200 barrels per day. So that's an enormous range. There are very, very few of those elephants, the supergiant fields. And they were all discovered in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And they're all getting old and tired. So it takes a lot of discovery of very small fields to replace one of those. So the Association for the Study of Peak Oil publishes a yearly updated forecast for what it's all going to look like, including both regular conventional oil, which is the stuff at the bottom, and then various kinds of non-conventional liquid fuels, and then natural gas and unconventional natural gas right at the top. And this is showing a peak of regular oil around 2005, a peak for all liquids, and in fact for all oil and gas around 2010. So how are we doing? Well, seems to be right on schedule. Regular conventional oil reached a maximum in May of 2005, just over 74 million barrels a day, and there hasn't been a single month since May 2005 in which that record rate of production has been exceeded. And that's in the context of extremely high global oil prices, up in the range of $80 to $83 a barrel. So there's every incentive, if there are any countries in the world that could produce more oil and bring it to market, there's every incentive for them to do so. But it appears that it's getting more and more difficult for that to happen. Now, natural gas is a little less certain. We don't know quite as much about natural gas as we do about oil, but we do know that there are regional natural gas supply problems already appearing, for example, in North America. This slide shows the U.S. Department of Energy forecasts for North American natural gas supply. The top yellow line is what they thought it would look like back in 2002, and it looked pretty good. In 2003, they weren't quite as optimistic. In 2004, they had to revise their forecast downward quite a bit. And by 2006, it looks pretty bad. And I would have to say that 2006 forecast is still very optimistic. The U.S. is in a natural gas supply crisis that's about to get much, much worse. Russia's natural gas supply is very large, but Russia has made enormous promises especially to Europe, for supplying that natural gas, and it's looking like Russia is going to have a tough time meeting its obligations. This is another picture of fossil fuel depletion, in this case coal. This is a case of the UK, and of course Great Britain was the site of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It had an enormous amount of coal. In fact, the energy embodied in the coal in Great Britain to start with was about equivalent to the energy embodied in the oil originally present in Saudi Arabia. And this is what's happened over the course of a couple of hundred years. Britain has essentially extracted and used virtually all of that fossil fuel energy. But there's lots of coal elsewhere. Certainly. Now, we're often told that we have a couple of hundred years worth of coal. When that kind of figure is cited, that's called a reserve to production ratio. In other words, the amount currently being produced as a fraction of what's left, and then averaging that out over the whole time. Now, reserve to production ratios always lie. They are never accurate. Why? Because we never extract a non-renewable resource at a constant rate until one day it completely runs out. No, it always shows a kind of bell-shaped curve of recovery over time where we increase the rate of extraction, the demand grows, we increase it until we get to the point where it just physically becomes impossible to continue increasing the rate at which we extract the stuff. Then the rate of extraction begins to decline until eventually it reaches a negligible level again. So it's the peaking analysis that's important for oil, for natural gas, and for coal as well. Now, very few peaking studies have been done for coal. The best and most recent was done by the Energy Watch Group of Germany, which used the latest reserve estimates from around the world. And interestingly, the most recent reserve estimates tend to be the most pessimistic. Several decades ago, geologists were applying pretty rough and ready techniques to estimating the amount of coal that might eventually be recovered. But they've revised their studies, they've revised their techniques considerably since then, and the result is much more pessimistic resource estimates. So when the Energy Watch Group applied a peaking analysis to these most recent reserve estimates, they arrived at the shocking